pick which passage I'm going to speak on during the course of the week. I have 4 to choose from, and this week it was, oh my gosh, the Old Testament story. I really want to be able to talk about the Old Testament story and the New Testament story. I really want to talk about that and how on earth in the little bit of time am I going to be able to do that. And so I've done my best that when talking about the loaves and the fishes to scale back that particular part of the service. And then when talking about the wrestling, I'll do what I can to pin down a couple points. So, did you catch the 2 puns? The audience is a little sleepy here today. Well, I guess let's just begin with the Old Testament story. We have an interesting scenario, and we couldn't go into all of the background of why this story happened. But if you remember, Jacob was a trickster. He was one who stole the birthright from his brother. He tricked him out of it. And then Jacob, in what some would call karma, Jacob, the trickster, runs into a bigger trickster. And so you have this Laban, and you have Jacob, and these two are going at each other in every which way. One of my favorite stories is that Jacob swings a deal, and he says, I'll take all of the spotted animals since I'm caring for, you get all of those of a solid color, and I get all of the spotted ones. And then he put spots on everything. And it said the animals bred in such a way that the spotted ones outnumbered the plain. So you had the tricksters going back and forth with each other. And in the midst of all of that, God is doing something in the heart of Jacob. And if you recall, if you were here last week, you may recall that one of the things I said is that above your physical health, above your financial wealth, above all things, God desires holiness and wholeness within you. Transformation of your old self into the new creation, into the image of Jesus Christ. That's the primary objective. And that if that doesn't happen, then it really doesn't matter how much health you have. It doesn't matter how much wealth you have, because you've missed the mark. The mark is for us to be transformed and changed into the likeness of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
In terms of our character, in terms of our goals, in terms of our behavior, in terms of all that we think and do, we mirror the life of Jesus Christ. Wesley called it that we move onward towards Christian perfection. That was the phrase that he used. I don't like to use that word perfection because we immediately say that it's not possible, and so then we discount it, but we can't throw away the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes. We are to be engaged, and we are to be growing. We are to be such that if somebody knew us 5 years ago and they meet us now, do they see growth in us? Or are we the same crabby person that we were then? We are to be growing. And this story of Jacob is full of all kinds of illusion of change. And we are coming now to a dramatic point because Jacob is leaving Laban. He's going to settle out on his own. And he hears your brother, the one that you took stuff with, is coming, and he's heavily armed. And so Jacob is very, very concerned for his life. So we didn't get that backdrop. There's also another interesting backdrop that in verse 1 of the chapter that we read, Jacob makes this comment that or the writer makes the comment that Jacob notices that angels are camping nearby. And I think what's important to catch from that is a couple weeks ago we heard Jacob say, surely the presence of the Lord is in this place and I didn't know it. And he's now come to a point where he recognizes angels when they're camping near him. So there's been some growth, there's been some transformation, there's been that spiritual sensitivity has gone from being dead to being awakened and to be alive. So Jacob splits his family and sends them on ahead and gives himself a night alone. And it says that's when a man appears and they begin to wrestle. And when I said that there's several things that show an allusion here, we go that Jacob goes from being at the end of the line, that we find out that when he decides to meet Esau, he moves ahead of the group so that he can meet Esau. And we see that there's been a change of heart there. We find that he begins wrestling at night, but by daytime he's a different person. And he goes from Jacob, of he who grabs by the heel and is one who tricks people, to Israel, he who wrestles with God. And I think it's, even though the introduction of this wrestler says a man, the text clearly indicates this is some divine intervention. Some commentators say it was a pre-incarnate Christ, some say it was an angel. Whoever it was, this is someone that is of heavenly origin and is someone who is a lot stronger than the text gives credit for. Because it says that he couldn't break free, but yet with just a touch, his hip goes out. And, it brought me back to the days of, when my children were small, and I let them wrestle with me. I still won those matches, but I let them wrestle, and we had fun with that. And I certainly didn't use all of my strength, and it was not only for fun, but it was also for their growth. So what can we take away from that particular story? Well, I think that we can take away is that it is in our best interest to be honest and to be forthright with God and to wrestle with the questions and the doubts and the fears and the issues that we have. I find that many times within church or within a church structure, people will just say, well, just, don't ask questions, just do this and just believe that. And there's a time for doing, but I think that there is something healthy in being able to say, God, I really don't understand and I don't get this. Amen. And having that work out. I put it this way. I can't take credit for coining the phrase, but it's a humdinger, and it's this: that a faith that can't be tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. Oh. And we find here that Jacob's faith is tested, and that in the end, it becomes such that his faith can be trusted. And that we hear later on, as God identifies himself, I think it is with pride that God says, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. That Jacob wrestles with God in the darkness of uncertainty, in the time of fear and trembling. and allows God to transform him in that time. I heard a person say that they never trusted a Christian leader if they didn't walk with a limp. Now they're speaking figuratively, but you get the idea that it means that they've been on the wrestling mat with God, and that they have walked and that they have wrestled with things. And sometimes that wrestling match is looking objectively at what God shows us of what's in our heart and what lies within us. You know, I'll put it this way. I'm far less likely to judge people today at age 59 than I was at age 16. Because between those years, I learned, gosh, I've messed up too. And I've messed up big sometimes. And I've needed God's grace, and people were kind enough to give me God's grace. I walk with a limp because I know I'm not perfect.
Amen.
And I know that, but I also know that God is faithful.
Amen.
And so, how does that, and by the way, did you notice how Psalm 17 fit with that, of crying out in the night and that God delivering it? Whoever put these scriptures together, I just always marvel at their wisdom of doing so. So now we come to the New Testament reading, and it's like, well, how do you get the wrestling with the fish? Well, I have fought a big one every now and then, but I think where I would go with this is Jesus gives an interesting challenge. The setting is such that there's a huge mob of people, 5,000 men plus women and children. Do the math, I think you're easily in excess of 10,000 people, maybe 15,000. There's a lot of folks there. And it's late and everybody's hungry, and the disciples say, I think we need to get these people home. The disciples are acting in the best interest of those people, and they also know of their limitations. We can't do anything here, so let's, before it gets any later and they're out in the desert in the dark, let's get them into town so that they can be refreshed. And here is where the challenge comes, in that Jesus doesn't say that's a great and prudent idea. Jesus says, you feed them. You feed them. Well, suppose I told you that in about 90 minutes, the village of Williamston's coming here for lunch, and I said you'd feed them. I'm sure the bishop would be asked to make a new appointment, right? You'd think I was crazy. You'd say, we don't have anything. And look at us. How could we possibly do that? Does this sound like a wrestling match? Does this sound like a time of uncertainty? And yet, they bring forth fish and they bring forth bread. This is an interesting and powerful story because it is one story that is found in all four Gospels. So all four writers thought this story is so important that it's included in each one. You know, when you hear certain stories or certain things of people, lots of things can come to mind. You know, like if you mention my Grandpa Moser, well, I think, gosh, I remember seeing him at a tour at Kellogg, sitting by a machine, almost asleep. I can remember him taking me fishing. Why, I remember that time he asked to see my loose tooth, and he unloosened it to my surprise and handed it to me. I remember how he forever answered for me the question of where did God come from? what he just said he always was. And as a young child, that satisfied me. And it does now as an older child. So it is that when we come to this story of the fish and the loaves, what might this bring to mind? Well, it has to bring to mind, especially to people of Jewish background, the fact that, oh my gosh, here's another example of taking us back to the creation story where God takes very little and brings about very much. You know, it takes us back to the time of Moses and the Exodus of, again, when God provided food and water and cared for people in the wilderness. It takes us to the story of the prophets of where oil that never ran out and the dead raised. It's got to take them back to the time of communion, of when, again, he broke bread and he shared with them. So, as we consider this New Testament story, I think that we should remember all of these things that I've mentioned and then respond to the challenge of Christ that you feed them, that you give your life and put it into the hands of Jesus to minister to the needs of the world and the surroundings that you find yourself in. And trust me, we live in a world that needs godly people, that needs grace, that needs the truth and the righteousness and the goodness of God in every corner. Dare I say, even the sanity of God is desperately needed in our world. And we find ourselves going, this is way too big. Send them somewhere, God, and take care of them. And our message instead is wrestle with me and you feed them. And I'll do the rest. And so it's up to us to respond in faith and say, here I am, Lord. Send me. I have probably as much to offer as a few loaves and a few fish. But it is amazing what God can and will